Hello everybody, this is Connor at BoatsDon'tSink here with another Shadowverse video. This time we're not going to be doing a deck profile though. I've got something a little different to start off BP06. We're going to be looking at a tier list, since we've got the Grand Showdown coming up later this month, as well as the first couple of BCS events that'll be in the BP06 format. I wanted to sort of run through a wide variety of decks, sort of look at where I think they fall in the meta, what these tournament environments are going to look like, and talk a little bit about that. This will probably be a bit longer one. I've got about 20 or so decks that I want to look at. Just a brief overview of them and where and why I put them in each tier. The tiers are not going to be organized within themselves. I'm just going to have these organized by class. So yeah, and I'll explain a little bit about each tier sort of as we go. But I wanted to get this out just because we are sort of moving into probably some of the biggest tournaments the game has had in English so far. So moving in, the first decks that I want to talk about are my honorable mentions. These are decks that I don't think are quite good enough to really be considering for events like the Grand Showdown or the BCS regionals. However, they are decks that I think are perfectly fine for locals environments or maybe even showdown challenges. They're decks that are going to be a little on the weaker side, but if you are willing to dedicate a lot of time to learning matchups with them and optimizing them, they are probably still perfectly fine to play. Just know that they're not going to be the ones winning these big events, most likely. The first deck I have in this tier is actually a little bit of a funny one. This is the Colosseum sword deck. This isn't actually something I've seen a whole lot of talk about, other than like right before the set came out. Some people were kind of theory crafting this. Taking a look at this deck, you might be wondering, like, what on earth is going on here? What is this deck? This is Steadfast Samurai Colosseum on high, like, prison combo kind of thing. Steadfast Samurai can't take combat damage, and Colosseum on high effectively gives all followers ward. It makes it so if a follower can attack another follower, it can't attack leaders. So as long as you have Steadfast Samurai out and he's engaged, your opponent has to keep attacking him instead of you, but he doesn't take combat damage, so they'll never kill him. And you basically just try to get this set up on like turn 6, maybe turn 7, and basically become invincible for the rest of the game. You play some cards like Armor of the Stars to give him aura so they can't just use removal effects on him. Gino can search the amulet so you can consistently get your Colosseum out. And then you have cards like Alexander just to keep clearing your opponent's board, because it does do the same for them, so you'll have to clear their followers before you can hit them. But cards like Alexander let you sort of just hit multiple bodies at once and clear a path to start beating them down. This deck is in my honorable mentions because it does have some matchups where once you get set up, you basically can't lose. Decks like Sword itself and Forest don't actually really have any way to answer the Steadfast Samurai once it's resolved. And that's also going to be the case for like some Haven decks and things like that. Really, your more like aggro, dedicated go face decks are just not going to have a way to get through the Steadfast Samurai. However, at the same time, there's not really a way to protect him from AoE damage or effects like Bane. So those are still going to take him out. Cards like Themis Decree. So he's definitely not the be-all, end-all. Over half of the meta can just instantly sort of shut him down. But the other half can't beat him at all. So this makes a pretty funny locals deck. Even for like showdown challenges and stuff, if you think you're going to be playing against a lot of Sword and Forest. And just take free wins against those decks. However, you know, for bigger events, not really consistent enough to only play those for 7 or 8 rounds. You can also play things like Lyriel to sort of dodge burn damage killing you, since they can't attack you. It's an interesting deck, but definitely not something that I think makes the tier list. Next up, a little bit more of a real sword deck. We have the Usurpation Sword. This deck didn't get a whole lot of change in BP06, so this is the deck based on the Omen of Usurpation, Octress. It's a mill deck where you're milling your opponent. and then getting benefits based off the number of cards in your opponent's cemetery. Once they hit 10, you get a lot of extra effects turned on. You have ways to steal cards from their cemetery. You have followers that get extra attack when you mill them, or if they have enough cards in cemetery. And then you have a lot of cool, like, mid-rangey removal, like, card draw tools. So it's got a lot of stuff going for it. The biggest issue right now is that all of these require you to fill your opponent's cemetery, and two of the best decks, Abyss and Rune, both want a bunch of cards in their cemetery, so you're really just kind of helping their strategy a lot of the time. And they are usually going to be the decks that are doing better things than you. Rune can combo kill you, Abyss can just grind you out. And in this meta in particular, I don't think mid-rangey decks are super well positioned, just because there is a lot of like very fast aggro in this meta, and there's also a lot of, or not a lot, but there is one deck that is very popular that's a sort of combo kill deck that once it hits its threshold, kind of just blows you up. And so mid-rangey decks, they're not fast enough to beat the aggro decks, but they're also too slow to kill the combo deck before it gets to go off. So some issues there. BP06 did give this deck a couple new cards in the Thief trait that sort of help the mill strategy. I don't think either of them are like particularly game-changing for the deck. You probably don't even play either of them. But yeah, so very similar to the BP05 list, which I did do a deck profile on. I just don't think I think it's still a plenty strong deck, just not super well positioned in this meta in particular. Third deck I have here is the Garyu Dragon deck. So this is one of the new legendaries from BP06 Garyu. He's a 5-drop 3/4 evos to a 4/5. His big thing is that all of your other Dragoncraft followers get Ward while he's on the field. And then when you evolve into him, you can summon a cost 5 or lower Dragoncraft follower from your hand. So this is going to be a pretty typical Dragoncraft deck in the early game. You have some ramp stuff to get to your Garyu faster. Normal like followers that are going to have removal effects. Cards like Dragon Summoner and even the Emissary spell from set 1 can be pretty good to help you find both Garyu and good summon targets by the time you hit him on curve. Because this is one of the issues of the deck is that you need to both hit Garyu for it to do anything. And then also have good enough things to do with Garyu to like cheat in good 5-drops. So it's a little inconsistent on actually getting all the pieces together, especially if they're answered the first time, finding 2 more pieces to do it a second time. But the part where the deck really shines is you have some pretty cool 5-drops to be bringing in. One of the new ones meant for Garyu, Jadelong Tactician, is a 5-drop with Storm that Strike gives another follower +1/+1, but if it's targeting Garyu, it gives him +2/+2. So you can kind of try to keep him around, keep your sort of ward effect up. Phoenix Empress is a cool one. She has Rush, and then whenever she dies, you can like unramp yourself. You can decrease your max play points to bring her back engaged. Which means that you can ward her, and then when they kill her, you can bring her back warded like over and over again, as long as you're willing to lose max play points. And that can be pretty cool if you get up to like, 7, 8, 9, because the deck doesn't really have a whole lot going on past the point where you start doing the Garyu stuff. It's also pretty neat with Electromagical Rhino from set 5. This card didn't really have a home before, but giving a 7 defense follower ward is pretty great. And you get to bring him in for free on the same turn as Garyu, so that's pretty cool. It's also nice with cards like Wyvern Cavalier that just give you extra value from coming in. Just any of the 5-drops like that are quite good with them. Main reason I don't have him in any real tier is, A, like I said, the setup is a little inconsistent. You have to get a lot of pieces together. But B, you also have to like find ways to kill your opponent. Like you can play good Storm followers here, but this is another one of those kind of mid-rangey decks that just doesn't have good ways to race the combo decks and is a little too slow. That's one of Dragon's big issues this set overall, really, is if you're playing cards like Dragon Oracle, you're just too slow for the aggro decks. Next, we have Yokai Abyss. This is another one of the new archetypes introduced in set 6. This one is a bit interesting because a lot of the Yokai cards are actually very powerful. or not a lot, but Gensetsu in particular, their legendary, is a very powerful card that we'll see play in a lot of the Abyss decks this set. But she is sort of the cover face card for the yokai deck. Basically, she reduces the cost of your yokai cards and gains attack whenever a yokai follower leaves. And she makes your yokai followers deal more damage. So she has just all these effects that make all your yokai cards significantly more powerful. She makes 5 yokai trait tokens that you get to play for free once she's evolved. You have cards like Zashiki Warashi that allow you to discard yokai to draw more cards, gain life. Demonic Procession checks top 5 to find you yokai followers. So you have lots of like consistency tools. Shuten Doji can evolve by banishing yokai from your cemetery without actually using his evolve effect. So that lets you evolve multiple followers in a single turn. Kasha can recur them from cemetery or deal damage to enemy followers, which is increased by Gensetsu. Biggest issue here is I've just shown you every yokai card. So there's a lot of synergies between them that they want to work, but there aren't that many of them. So you end up having situations where, you know, your cemetery is just a bunch of non-yokai cards and you can't resolve your effects, especially because Kasha wants them to like be able to add back from cemetery to hand. Shuten Doji is banishing them, so you have some like conflicting stuff going on there. Zashiki Warashi wants to discard them to draw cards, but Gensetsu kind of wants them in your hand to be able to play for cheaper. It's just kind of a lot of conflicting effects going on, and while Shuten Doji being able to Evo and give another follower Storm can lead to like really bursty turns where you get to do a lot of damage, I think it's just like kind of an inconsistent deck overall that doesn't have enough tools to really get where it wants to be. Hopefully sometime in the future we'll get some more support for this deck, but I just don't think it really has all the tools to be like a consistent good deck that it needs right now. Next we have the Playpoint Haven deck. I don't really know what to name this, but Playpoint Haven seems fine because the whole deck does revolve around having playpoints open. So Karula is the sort of cover legendary here. He's another one from BP06. As I said, this whole deck, a lot of your cards revolve around effects that needs you to have play points left at the end of your turn. So you need to not spend all of them or have ways to recover them. Karula himself recovers you 2 play points at the start of your end phase, and then has effects for 2, 4, and 6 play points that you have left to just keep doing more and more things. He's actually quite a powerful card. He does burn damage, removal, and draws you cards. As long as you're not playing on your own turn or have ways to recover play points. And a lot of the support around him that was introduced in BP06. Phantom Blade Wielder does damage to enemy followers if you have play points. Gravity Grappler makes you a token if you have 2 play points left. And then you have cards like Barrage Brawler and Deus Ex Machina from set 5 that recover you play points at your end phase. And that will allow you to play cards and then recover play points, still trigger your effects. It feels like this should be a control deck, leaving play points up. You would expect this to be a, you know, draw past control, get all your effects. In reality, this is actually more of an aggro deck. You're trying to just run out as many cards as possible. You have a lot of burn effects tied to your recovering play points. Or having play points left over. Barrage Brawler deals 1, Karula deals 2. So you're actually kind of just trying to run out as many things as possible and get all these effects triggering as fast as possible. And then you do play a few quick spells, mostly cheaper ones like Blackened Scripture and Surefire Bullet. And there is also a quick spell designed specifically for this deck called Focus. To just sort of make use of those 2 extra play points you get. You're really just trying to hit 2 over and over again to burn 2. This deck is cool. It's a very neat concept, and the cards are very synergistic. The issue is they are all very low cost. A lot of them involve discarding cards, and it leaves you in a position where you kind of burn out super fast. Deus Ex Machina can help by drawing you 4 more cards over and over again, but it's a deck similar to the Garyu deck where you need to see all of your pieces at the right time. So because they have a lot of synergy with each other, but not many of them do enough on their own. So it leaves you in a position where if you only draw some of your good cards, but not the rest, especially if you don't draw Karula, your deck doesn't do a whole lot, and it just kind of falls apart. The last deck I have in the honorable mentions tier here is the Spell Uma Musume deck. So this is basically the same deck we've had since, December of last year. Daiwa, Scarlet, and Vodka being able to just create giant boards for very cheap, using spells to buff all your followers. We did just recently get Trial Initiation and Econodictus unrestricted, so you can play 3 copies of each of those, giving the deck a pretty big boost to its consistency. It has a strong spell package in just cheap removal spells and Agnes Tachyon to serve as additional removal and recursion of the spells. And it does actually have a lot of good finisher effects between Silent Suzuka, Ogre Cap, and Narita Brian, things we've seen, for the better part of a year now. Very good cards, very good deck. The reason I have it all the way down here in honorable mentions now, unfortunately, one of the deck's issues has always been its inability to deal with wide boards. And more of the good decks in the format now are able to make wide boards that the spell deck just can't answer very efficiently. Ogre Cap is kind of its only AoE damage effect that it usually plays. There were some Smart Falcon decks popping around here and there that can do AoE damage, but they are still a bit slow. A lot of these aggro decks are making wide boards by like turn 3 or 4. You can't really clear them by then anyway. And as removal is getting better in the control decks, it is becoming harder to stick Daiwa and Vodka to the board and be able to start like snowballing into that quick lethal turn. A lot of the times your followers are just going to get answered instantly now. Moving up into tier 3. So my tier 3, these are decks that I think are fine to take to events like regionals. They are going to be on the weaker end of the decks that I think are fine, but it wouldn't surprise me to see some of these sneak into, top 8s here and there. I think they have good matchups into some of the relevant decks, bad matchups into others. You might be taking a little bit of a coin flip by bringing these, but again, they're decks that if you really want to dedicate yourself to them and try to optimize them, they should be more than fine, power level wise, to take in and try to top with. The first deck I have here is Hunter Forest. I know some people are going to be unhappy with me for putting it this low on the tier list, but remember, these are still decks that I think are perfectly fine to take to regionals. They just don't have great matchups into everything. So the Hunter deck is kind of an archetype that was introduced in set 5, but got a significant amount of support here in set 6, getting the legendary Lamaga Forest Champion. So as you can tell, just from Lamaga herself, her Fanfare and On Evolve effect, look at your top 4 and summon a cost 4 or lower Hunter. We're going to be doing a lot of summoning off of the top of the deck and from other zones to bring followers in and just sort of build very tempo-based, not quite stompy, but similar to like a stompy style deck. Just build big boards and try to overwhelm the opponent that way. Looking at the new Wildwood Matriarch and last set's Apostle of Unkilling, both of these also summon in cost 2 or lower Hunters. And then we have cards, the unevolved Wildwood Matriarch, it evolves automatically if it's brought in by an effect, so Lamaga can cause it to evolve. And Woodland Cleaver, which is, it's a 2-drop that gains Storm if it's brought in by an ability. So some of your big turns could be like, play Lamaga, Evo, or play Lamaga top 4, find a Wildwood Matriarch, Fanfare at Evos, you bring back a Woodland Cleaver, Storm your opponent. You're just doing a lot of stuff like that to keep rebuilding very big boards, try to get some storm damage here and there with Woodland Cleaver, and then just have too many things for your opponent to answer because your deck is quite efficient. You do also play a lot of just Hunter trait synergy cards. The new Crossbow Sniper deals 1 to any enemy target and draws you a card for discarding a Hunter. And then there are the cards, of course, from the Unkilling archetype in set 5, that checked for having you Hunters in your cemetery. So Servant of Unkilling and Izudia himself are quite good cards to also include in this deck. Just to have all the Hunter synergies, and because they are pretty good board presence cards. that benefit this strategy. So I think this deck is pretty notable, just as something that's going to force a lot of removal, force decks to answer it. The issue is that it is generally just too fair, I think. You're not really doing anything broken. You have a little bit of removal tied to some of your followers, but not a lot, which means you're going to have to end up doing like combat removal if you ever have to get rid of threatening boards that outpace you. And again, it's kind of one of those decks where your boss monster checks off the top 4. If you miss, it can feel pretty bad and feel like you wasted a turn. Or if you just don't see Lamaga, it can be hard to get some of those big chains set up to close out the game. So just sort of, I wouldn't call them consistency issues, but you do have some cards that power spike a lot harder than others. And even then, you're not really doing anything super unfair. So I think this deck is very, very good, very just straightforward in what it wants to do. But the power level might just not quite be as high as it needs to be to like really be a meta threat. Next, I have the Earthright Rune deck. This deck's kind of funny. This deck's sort of popped in and out of relevance from set to set. I know everyone that's keeping up with the JP meta kind of has it on their radar for the next 3 or 4 sets. It keeps getting like one new busted card every set. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but it does still have some really good things going for it. Obviously, most of the strategy that this deck revolves around is using amulets that have stack, getting stacks set up, and then spending them to make a bunch of golems. Ancient Alchemist and Golem Protection both make guard forms, which have Ward. One of the reasons I think this deck is at least in tier 3 right now is Ward is very good right now. It stops aggro decks, and this deck can make a lot of wards for relatively cheap. So you're able to sort of defend yourself against some of the aggro decks. Ancient Alchemist burns any enemy every time a golem enters and makes them cost less. So the big thing there is that you can use it as removal or use it as burn damage to just kill your opponent quite quickly. We got in set 5 the Iron Staff mechanic, which lets you get 2 1-cost cards and play them for free, kind of turning it into like a pseudo Olivia, where you get to choose 2 modes from any of the 1-drops you play. Generally, these are going to be your stack amulets, either drawing you cards or gaining you life. Very actually similar to what Olivia does. But this also helps you set up your Earthright effects, which obviously Olivia wouldn't. And can lead you into some pretty powerful like burst turns following right after Iron Staff mechanic. The big thing is that we did actually get some cool support cards in this set that help with some of the issues the deck had. So Mirror of Truth lets you bring an Alchemist follower from cost 3 or less back from your cemetery, and is an amulet with stack. Big thing here is that this means we're no longer punished for running out Ancient Alchemist just on turn 3 and hoping it lives to evolve it early, since it's 3 to play, 3 to evolve. This allows you to run it out, and even if your opponent answers it, you can just Mirror of Truth it back, and then sack the mirror to make 2 guard forms. It gives you a lot more consistency, and it leaves you a lot less open to being punished by going for your really high roll plays. Because if Ancient Alchemist does survive, and then you get to evolve it on turn 4 and start pushing up golems immediately, it's very hard for your opponent to answer at that point. Golem Rampage is a 2-cost spell. You sack a golem to deal 3 to each enemy leader and enemy follower. 2 cost for 3 damage sweeper is insane into aggro decks, and it burns your opponent, so it can help you just close out the game. I think this is honestly the card that makes the biggest difference here. And so many things in the deck make golems that you shouldn't really ever have a shortage of them to be sacking for this. Hulking Giant is also some more like single target removal and burn damage on a pretty reasonable body. Not entirely sure how important this card is to the deck's strategy, but it's another new one that we got for the deck in this set. The issue with this deck, as you're going to hear me say with so many of them, your cards rely too much on synergy. So you have to find stacks and then cards to spend them. If you find them in the wrong order, you don't get to do anything. But when you do find them in the correct order and your stuff sticks, it's a very powerful deck. You get lots of bodies, lots of damage. It can be pretty hard for some of the like aggro decks to answer. Control decks are going to have a little easier time clearing your board, so you're not incredibly favored into control decks, but I think this is a great one for beating up like Forest, Sword, Abyss, things like that are like aggressive decks. Ramp Dragon! Ramp Dragon is kind of the same as it always was. It didn't really actually get a whole lot this set. So, you know, you're doing ramp things, you're doing Dragon Oracle, you're doing Sybil. You're trying to get to high play points as fast as possible to slam big guys like Shenlong, Israfil, and Genesis Dragon to sort of just take over the game with unanswerable threats. You have tons of removal, Blazing Breath, Serpent Wrath, Conflagration, Blind Your Screen, and Orange real quick. So it's kind of just the usual that it's been since like set 1. You just keep getting bigger cards to play, and like more ramp tools. The one new thing that it got this set is Phylene. She's a 1-drop. She taps something down and freezes it. Her spell destroys an engaged follower, and if you have Phylene, it burns your opponent. At Overflow, she searches the spell, and the spell costs less, so this is just more removal options for you. And it's also early game anti-aggro that can help you ramp more consistently. This deck has actually always kind of been pretty well positioned. It's kind of weird to put it in tier 3 here. The problem is it's always been a slow deck that wins long games by getting to 10 and just establishing big threat after big threat over and over again until the opponent stops being able to answer them. In this meta, you might just get killed before you get there. There's a lot of the aggro decks are going to be forcing you to spend your turns on removal instead of ramping and getting to your big guys, which means you could just run out of cards or fall behind too early and not be able to like stabilize and catch back up. Next, we have the Necro Charge Abyss deck. This deck saw a lot of play in set 4 when Ektar and Israfil came out. It's pretty much based around the Necro Charge keyword, right? Fill your cemetery with 10 or 20 if you can get there. It's a lot easier this set. Cards, play Ektar, summon a bunch of 2-drops from your cemetery. Lesser Mummy gets Storm to kill your opponent, or you can get Demoniums to sort of stall out the game and be defensive. We got a lot of cool tools last set, set 5. Wings of Lust lets you fill your cemetery a lot quicker. It's a 1-cost spell. You can draw 1, ditch 1, which puts 2 cards in your cemetery, and also deal 2 damage to an enemy follower. So it's actually like good angelic snipe adjacent removal for the aggro decks and fills your cemetery. Thundering Roar is a removal spell or a discard spell that does both at Necro Charge 10. And in this deck, you're hitting that on like turn 5, so Thundering Roar is just always the most obnoxious card ever. And then, in addition, this set, we got some cool like mid-gamey tools. Yuzuki is one of the new golds from this set. You can pay 3 and discard her from your hand to deal 5 to an enemy follower and bury the top card of your deck. That puts 2 cards in your cemetery and is a removal spell that does a lot of damage, so that's very good for helping set up your Necro Charge. And Gensetsu, which we already talked about, she makes tokens, which don't fill up your cemetery, but she's a very good Death's Breath target, so she's good to mill off your other effects. And she's just good for stalling out the mid-game to help you set up a little longer to get into your Ektar turns. Especially if you go second, Gensetsu on 6 into Ektar on 7. Even if you're not bringing much back from your cemetery, if the Foxes survive, you get to buff them with Ektar and just go in that way, so... pretty good synergy there. Issue with this deck is, surprise, as with many others, it's slow. A lot of your early turns revolve around playing the cards like Emperor's Command, or Grave Desecration is the non-collaboration one. I'm used to playing against the Code Geass cards. Grave Desecration or Sparthway Sergeant, Bone Chimera, cards like that that are quite slow on board but fill your cemetery very quickly to try to get into your explosive turns. If you can get set up without just dying, this deck is very powerful and has some huge, insane turns once you get to like 7 and onward, or even 6 and onward with Death's Breath. However, prior to that, you are pretty weak to the aggro decks, and even the control decks can use your early slow turns to just sort of amass their resources to be able to answer your later turns better. And that leaves it in a kind of questionable position. But if you hit your curve and survive into the late turns, you can do some really crazy things with like Ektars and Lesser Mummies. Next, we have Control Haven. This is, again, kind of an old existing deck. Pretty much based around the Heavenly Aegis Guardian Sun Unkillable combo. We've seen this before. Haven has some of the best removal spells in the game between Acolyte's Light and Themis Decree, and last set we got the Saviors. It's another like angelic snipe adjacent card, but can also search Marwyn. We have great sort of mid-gamey defensive cards. Marwyn's giant ward aura that heals us and ramps us. Ether is a ward that can search other followers into play to just keep board presence for us, keep healing us, keep doing whatever we need to. So pretty solid deck all around. Biggest issue with why it's ended up in this tier in this set is actually the Abyss decks. Yuzuki has a fanfare that forces the opponent to just put their followers into Cemetery. That gets around Heavenly Aegis and Marwyn's Aura, which means it is like a super just easy, efficient way to force the opponent to lose their sort of defensive cards that were supposed to win them the game. In addition, control deck is... It's good against aggro decks because you have the early answers, but if you only draw your big cards, you can die. And against the, like, combo kill decks, you just don't really have good enough ways to interact with them. Since a lot of your interaction that can stop them from killing you is sorcery speed. You can only play it on your own turn. Cards like Acolyte's Light just don't quite do enough to stop them from killing you. It's a little, like, just awkward into all of those decks. And I think if you're trying to play a control deck, there are just better options this set. Next, we have the Ward Haven deck. So this is yet another New Haven archetype in this set. We got 2 New Haven decks. This one's actually pretty cool. It kind of builds on the Gemstone deck from set 3, which focused on followers that have a Ward and Storm. This deck is a lot more focused on just the ward side of that, so Wilbert on play can top 5 to put a cost 5 or lower ward follower into play. He gets Holy Lancer alongside him in the new set to be kind of the ideal target to bring in off of that. It's just got 2 removal effects and is a reasonable ward body. You can also play some of the older cards, 4 and 5 drops. Shrine Knight Maiden is an aura ward body that's incredibly hard to remove that you can cheat in off of him. Radiance Angel, Bird Keeping Disciple, things like that. It also has synergy with Bejeweled Shrine, Amethyst Lion, Ruby Falcon, all the Gemstone cards. They care about Storm or Ward, but guess what? All our guys do have Ward, so they meet that requirement. And in the new set, we get Saintly Leader and Holy Counterattack, which are both very good removal options that sort of play in with the whole Ward theme. This deck is very defensive. I think that puts it in a pretty good position against the aggro decks. You can just play cards like Snake Priestess and Bellringer Angel to defend against the early aggro decks. Issue is similar to like the Hunter decks and stuff, where you really need to see Wilbert. Just playing, you know, your 4 drops and 5 drops on curve is not good enough, just power level wise, to be able to keep up with what some of the other decks are doing and some of the more explosive turns they have. You really have to be doing things like hitting Wilbert into Holy Lancer to kill one of their followers, Evo kill one of their followers, and then have like 2 big bodies that they have to answer. You have to like really be getting those like 3-for-1 turns to outpace them. Otherwise, you're just not doing enough. And obviously, needing to hit your legendary boss guy is not the most consistent strategy. So he ends up in tier 3. I think, like I said, all these decks are super playable. A lot of people have the reaction of like, oh, tier 3 means like I shouldn't be playing it. If you want to play these decks and focus on them, they are all decks that I think are worth playing for their unique strengths. They're just not as well positioned as some of the other decks. And when we look at these tier 2 decks, you'll kind of see why if you've got any experience with them. So moving into tier 2, this is the funny part where, spoiler alert, I actually have 1 deck of each class in tier 2. I think I didn't even do that on purpose, but I think it shows just kind of how balanced this meta is in terms of whichever class you want to play. Like, I think all of them have very viable decks. So the first thing we're looking at is a forest deck. This is the Fairy Forest deck. A lot of people were probably mad that I had Hunter Forest in 3, and a lot of people were probably also surprised that I have Fairy Forest in 2. This has been kind of one of the like boogeyman decks that a lot of people have been talking about. It was the deck that had the most top 8 spots in Japan's Set 6 Grand Prix. But we'll sort of look at the cards here and I'll explain why I think it's a little iffy. So it's based around mainly the new card Amata's Fairy Blader. When he comes in, he puts a fairy token in your EX area and then buffs all of the all the pixie tokens in your EX area. And then he can give 2 of them on your field Storm, which lets you basically you're trying to like build up these like 3/3, 4/4, 5/5 tokens in your EX area and then push them up for like 0 or 1 play points. Give them Storm and just like burst huge amounts of damage into your opponent. Then we have Fairy Dragon, which is an absurd card. It's a 2-drop 0/4 that gets +1 attack for every pixie in your field and EX area. So like this can be a turn 2, 3, 4, or like turn 4 and 5. It can just be like a 7/4 sometimes, which is kind of crazy. So you get some like really powerful cards here. Like, there's no doubt these are some of the most powerful cards in the set across all the classes. And you play a lot of the older fairy generators like Elven Princess Mage, Fairy Circle. There's a new Spirit Shine spell that you can either make 2 tokens in EX area, or you can buff a pixie by +2/+2, so it's adjacent to Fairy Circle. These are all give you a lot of bodies to start buffing up and use with Amataz. You play buffers like Blessed Fairy Dancer, that gives +1/+1 to all your pixie followers. You play Elf Song, that gives +1/+1 to all your forest followers on field. So you can make really big numbers. You have really cheap cards. The deck is almost entirely like 2-drops and 1-drops. And then since everything is so cheap and you get to play a lot of them per turn, you play a lot of combo payoffs. So you can play cards like Spinaria to draw you more cards. You can play Sukuna, so combo 5, you get a 5/5 Storm. Rhinocerote, which gets plus attack for every card you've played before it, and then can also gain Storm on Evolve. Lots of options to just be very fast and pressure the opponent. Most people have this as one of the like top 2 decks in the format. Why do I have it in tier 2? Basically, the issue comes down to, and I think a lot of people have started realizing this, the deck has to get set up with the fairies and then do something with them. And if you're playing against aggro decks, setting up is hard. And even if you're playing against control decks, if your setup is too slow, then they're able to answer what you're trying to do because they have time to prepare for it. And it leaves you in a position where the fairy deck very desperately wants to draw turn 1 like fairy generator spell, so like Fairy Circle or Spirit Shine or something, into turn 2 big payoffs. So you either want to start seeing Blessed Fairy Dancer or Fairy Dragon like immediately after. And a lot of the opening hands where you don't find that combination of cards just end up being too slow against the other good decks in the format. Not always. It is very possible to have like somewhat slow setups where you just end up hitting like a turn 5 or 6 where you burst out 12 damage and it puts you back in the game. But the deck does have a tendency to brick on, oh no, my hand is like 2 Fairy Circles, a Spirit Shine, and like, I don't know, a Crystallia Lily. And it's like, I can make a bunch of tokens, but I can't do anything with them. Or you end up with just like a bunch of Amataz and no way to make tokens. So it kind of has that Earthright issue, right? Where you have to draw the enablers and the payoffs in the right order and fast enough. The payoff is just higher, and that's why I have it in a higher tier. Your cards also generally cost less, so you are faster. I think this is an incredibly powerful deck. It was one I was heavily considering for Grand Showdown. But after some testing, I think this deck falls more in line with the rest of the tier 2 decks than being a clean tier 1. Next, we have the aggro sword deck. So in previous sets, we've had a lot of different versions of sword. We've had heroic sword, we've had usurpation sword, we've had princess sword. I don't think there's a good way to define this deck other than aggro. Really, you're just playing a bunch of like 2 and 3 drops, mainly 3 drops, and 1 drops, and trying to curve them out and just be as fast as possible and do sword things. And the part of sword that sets it apart from the other aggro decks in general, and how it's always been, is that sword has a lot of cards that make multiple bodies for 1 card. So now we have a new legendary that benefits greatly from that. Ralmia costs 1 less to evolve for every other follower on your field. And then on evolve, you can pay 3 to give her +1/+1 for every other follower on your field. So if you play a Floral Fencer and all the tokens survive, you can play Ralmia the next turn, Evo her for 0, and then pay 3 and make her a 7/6 Storm, which is very aggro. This Romia is kind of the one linking thread that like all the aggro decks are going to have. It's kind of up to you from that point whether you play like a heroic package in it or just more generic stuff. But I think in general, the deck benefits greatly from cards that make multiple bodies. So Floral Fencer, obviously. Oathless Knight is a card that hasn't really seen a lot of play since set 1. But he's a 2-drop 1/1 that makes a 1/1. So you get 2/2 of stats for 2. But it's across 2 bodies. It's a little harder to remove for your opponent. He also evolves into a 3/1 Assail, which is great. Courtly Dance is a new sort of version of Heroic Entry. You pay 6, top 5, and put any number of cost 3 or lower in that add up to total cost of 7. 7 or less. So you can get like 3/2/1/1 and just make a full board for 6 off of 1 card. So you're basically trying to play cards that take more to answer from your opponent than you're spending on them. So they run out of answers before you run out of threats. There's also a lot of officers in the deck now. Since most of the tokens we're making are officers, most of the followers we're playing are officers. Both new legendaries in set 6 are officers, surprisingly enough, Romia and Kagamitsu. So Mars is actually very good synergy with the deck since she gives +1 attack to every officer that enters. And she's able to, on evolve, pay X to search for an officer to bring it in, which again helps us make boards of like multiple cards for only spending 1 card. Kagamitsu synergizes well with all of the evolves the deck wants to play. The deck tends to... Sword has always sort of tended to evolve like every turn if it can. Kagamitsu gets +1/+1 for every face-up evolved follower in your evolved deck when you play him. And he has Rush, so he gains Assail as well if you have at least 3 face-up. So he's very good at being removal or just being a 1-cost like 3/3, 1-cost 4/4. That's very good value to get onto the board. And of course, the deck typically is going to be playing Leonidas as well for those matchups that go a little bit longer. The control decks or just kind of the mid-rangey decks that you can't get quite enough bodies through in time. You can just kind of set up for a Leonidas play where you get the amulet down and then play your Courtly Dance afterwards, and now your 4 bodies that were like 2/2s are now 5/5s, and your opponent really just can't answer it. So that's kind of the gist of the deck, is just make too many bodies for them to be able to kill and beat them down with them. And I think that's very effective, this format, honestly. The consistency of the deck just keeps getting higher and higher because you get so much redundancy in your cards. And with cards like Gemstaff Commander, you're always going to have the right sort of setup threat that you need. Next, we have the Destruction Rune deck. This might be the hottest take of the tier list. A lot of people don't think this deck is very good. But I've been testing around with it, and I think that it got the tools it wanted this set. So the Destruction deck, introduced in set 5 with Lashena, Omen of Destruction, is a control deck. It focuses around using Lashena to get these 2 amulets into play that Destruction in White gains you 2 defense at your main phase, Destruction in Black deals 2 to the opponent at your main phase. Basically, if you can get these set up and then just stall the game out as long as possible, you have inevitability. You're healing every turn, you're burning them every turn. Eventually, with a 4 damage differential per turn, you will either be so far ahead of them in life that they just can't kill you, or you'll burn them out. One or the other. You have a lot of unique removal spells in this deck that the other builds of Rune don't get access to. Destructive Refrain is one of the cheapest sweepers in the game. For 3 play points, you can deal like 2 or 3 to your opponent's board. And it's a tutor for Lashena if you need to do that instead. Monochromatic Destruction is 2 cost, deal 2 to an enemy follower, gain you 2, deal 2 to your opponent, which is a ton of value for a 2 cost spell. You have to have 2 Idolatry cards on your field to do that, but that's just the 2 amulets. So once you get set up, these cards are quite powerful. And then you get, of course, the typical rune cards like Merlin and Agnes Tachyon to tutor these spells and reuse them over and over again. This deck wasn't fantastic in set 5. It was playable, but it had issues stabilizing. Because Lashena costs 4, the amulets cost 3 total. So it is a bit slow to get them into play. You have to be able to stabilize afterwards. But this set introduced a new package of rune followers that I think are quite good at helping with that. The Onmyoji cards have a lot of removal effects tied to them that are able to clear multiple followers at once, especially against the aggro decks, since you're dealing like lots of 2s and 4s. If 2s, 3s, and 4s can answer 3 separate bodies, you can afford to take a turn off to play Lashena, maybe take a hit or two, and then just remove their board, start healing back up, and you'll be fine. Previously, the deck struggled to do this, but I think these cards really get it where it needs to be. And, of course, you play a bunch of other burn spells. One of the strengths of this deck is that your damage is not combat-based, so you don't actually need to be able to get through wards or be able to stick followers, like play them and untap with them to be able to attack with them. You can just like play your followers as removal, and if your opponent answers them, you don't care. Most of your damage is coming from burn effects anyway. I think that leaves it in a very good position, this format. Obviously, the reason it's not tier 1, you do still have to manage to stabilize. Sometimes if you just don't draw the right removal, the fast aggro decks can still overwhelm you. I think the deck is fairly resilient to it, but not impervious, right? For Dragon, we have the Disdain deck, another one introduced in set 5. This is focused on the Omen of Disdain Galmu. This whole deck's theme is dealing effect damage to your own followers during your turn and then getting benefits from it. So Galmu herself deals 3 to any enemy when she takes damage. The rest of her cards, her support cards, either gain Storm or draw you cards or just have free abilities to deal damage to your followers. And then her spells are very over-spec removal. You have 3 damage for 1 play point and a 2 or 4 damage sweeper for 2 play points that just have the downside of having to deal a damage to a thing on your field. But that's what we want to do anyway, so lots of synergy. The deck can be very fast and have really good removal, actually, and punish the opponent for letting like anything live an extra turn. And the nice thing that we're able to capitalize on a little more this set, and what pushes this deck up a bit more than I think it was last set. Outside of Galmu, all of her support cards cost 3 or less, which makes this deck the perfect candidate for Prime Dragon Keeper, which allows us to, every time a cost 3 or lower Dragoncraft follower enters, we deal 2 to an enemy follower and 1 to the opponent. So that lets us focus our followers on just attacking our opponent over and over again and setting up all these burn and storm effects, and Prime Dragon Keeper is going to be keeping control of their board just by us playing these cards. And, of course, the new legendary Phylene works very well with this as well, since she is a 1-drop, she has additional removal. She has 3 defense as a 1-drop, so she's actually a really good target for some of our self-damage removal spells if we have to use them early. And, of course, her removal spell just helps us as well keep things under control. So, lots of synergy. The deck, you can argue, yeah, it does have that same issue of because it's so synergy reliant, if you don't draw all of your pieces together, you're going to have a bad time, and that is still true. The main difference is that this deck has a lot more consistency than some of the others, since its synergy pieces are able to dig for each other, and Galmu herself can recast cards from Cemetery. And I think this deck is just more explosive than some of the other synergy-based decks. It's more explosive faster. You can start churning out Storm followers on like turn 3, turn 4, and then immediately curve them into Galmus to just sort of close out a game as early as turn 5 or 6 sometimes. Really 6 is about the earliest you'll do it, but that's still very fast in this game. And I think that gets it high enough up, especially combined with the amount of removal it has. I think is a lot. It has better and higher quantity removal than a lot of the other synergy-based decks. Next up, we have Sanguine Abyss. This deck is... You see, this one's weird. So last set, we had the Lust Abyss deck, which was focused on Valnarek and all of the Omen of Lust support. However, this deck, despite being focused on the same keyword, Sanguine, actually cuts a lot of that stuff. We're kind of back more to the set 2 aggro Abyss deck. Obviously, we're using Aragavi the Berserker as the new legendary that this deck really benefits from. At the start of your end phase, if Sanguine's active, he deals 3 to any enemy. He's also a 3-cost 4/3, which is a fantastically aggressive stat line. He has a lot of support cards like Antelope Pelt Warrior that deal damage to yourself and just have over-spec stats. They do more than they need to for the downside of dealing damage to you, which is kind of what Sanguine's always been. Now we're just, instead of getting it in the form of effects, we're getting it in the form of giant stat lines. We're, of course, playing all of the one-drop suite of, like, Ambling Wraith, Disciple of Lust, Skeleton Fighter. But the rest of our deck, instead of being Omen of Lust stuff, we're actually going back to set 2 here with Razory Claw, Playful Necromancer, Dark General, as kind of just aggro cards. We're focusing a little less on the Sanguine synergy. We're playing good cards that trigger Sanguine anyway, like Razory Claw, and then some payoffs like Dark General. But cards like Playful Necromancer are just always aggro, regardless of whether we draw synergies. Whereas things like Valnarek, pretty bad if you don't have ways to trigger her effect, or ways to get a lot of Sanguine procs. So we're going for a little more simplified, streamlined aggro deck here. And of course, as aggro decks do, we're going to be running out our hand pretty quick. So Majerabane, the Omen of 1, is here to close out games. Once we've run our whole hand out, we can just play him, evo him, burn our opponent for 5, and leave a 6/6 that they have to answer. And hopefully that's just enough to close out the game on its own, and we don't need to draw more cards. So this deck is really good. This deck, compared to all the aggro decks, I think sort of the Forest, Sword, and Abyss decks here are kind of the 3 aggro decks that you're looking at in the format. And the way I like to think about them is Sanguine has the strongest turn 1, 2, 3. Forest has the best turns 4 and 5, where you're starting to get your Amataz and Spinaria combo turns. And then Sword has the strongest turns like 6 and 7, where you're hitting Courtly Dance, Leonidas Amulets, things like that just become unstoppable once they've resolved. They're all good at all of these points at the game, but those are sort of the turns that they focus on as their best turns. And this leaves them all as kind of unique aggro decks from each other that each specialize in being better at some other point, and that's why I think they can all be tier 2 decks without sort of pushing each other out. The Sanguine deck, like I said, it's really good in the first 3 turns. It lets you get ahead very early, especially since you have so many just, like, burn effects, and then cards like Aragavi that can come down and immediately deal damage. The last deck that we're looking at in tier 2 is Fable Haven. So this is actually another aggro deck. This one I think is a little more unique from the other 3. The Fable deck's been around since set 3. Most people should be fairly familiar with it. It is mostly actually a burn deck focused on dealing damage with Tin Soldier by putting Fable counters on it and removing them. Then also has Humpty Dumpty as a 3 damage burn to the leader and 5 to each follower on the field, which is just a sort of board reset that also damages your opponent. It does force you to discard your hand, and that's where I think most of the downside of this deck comes from, and kind of why the deck has been trying to move as far away from Humpty Dumpty as possible and maintain the other parts of the strategy. You have all of the Fable support cards, Alice, Pinion Prince, Marcher's Tea Time, that all allow you to sort of card advantage your way through the Fable cards. This allows you to set up your Tin Soldiers, set up your Humpty Dumpties, and be able to consistently get those good, like, burn turns. However, the rest of the deck, as of the last couple sets, has been moving in more of just like a 1 and 2 drop aggro direction. The deck very often plays like 9 1-drop 2/2s, and then it's lately been getting a lot more 2-drops, like Demon's Epitaph, which can evolve by discarding a card. It means going first, you can evolve this into a 3/4. It deals burn damage on death. This set, we get another 2-drop Phantom Blade Wielder that, on evolve, allows you to deal 2 to an enemy follower. So this is just more like cheap removal that's also allowing us to play aggressive stat lines on like turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, pressure our opponent very fast. The deck doesn't actually want to be evolving Humpty Dumpty because it means it loses its hand, and you want to have time to run out all of your hand before you evolve Humpty Dumpty. Evolving him with a 0-card hand is perfect, and then you're just hoping that you draw the last couple cards you need to end the game, which, in the case of Pinion Prince or Marcher's Tea Time, cards like that, they're just recurring cards from your cemetery. So you have a lot of cards you can draw that do sort of chain you back into exactly what you want to see. This is maybe the most powerful. It's probably the most powerful of the aggro decks when it actually goes off, just because It's a lot of burn damage. It's a lot of fast early turns. The issue is it's always been weak to aggro itself, because the opponent flooding the board with followers that it has to answer means that it needs to crack Humpty Dumpty earlier in order to clear them and save itself, which means it has to discard its hand, which means it goes into top deck mode, and, you know, top decking an Alice or a Tea Time gets you back in the game, but top decking a Goblin or a Phantom Blade Wielder when you need, you know, card advantage basically loses you the game on the spot, because you're now having to, like, play one guy and pass turn, and your opponent can capitalize on that to just get back, you know, a lot of advantage on their own side, and take the game back over. So it's probably the most RNG of the aggro decks, just because, you know, discarding your hand. you're playing in top deck mode a lot of the time, so it's very high ceiling, very low floor. But on average, I think it is strong enough to be in tier 2 here, especially since Humpty Dumpty does, you know, clear boards. It's also a pretty good removal deck. Lastly, we're moving into tier 1. Don't worry, this video is almost over. This tier is shorter than the others. The first deck I have here in tier 1 is probably the least surprising deck on this tier list, D-Shift Rune. So D-Shift Rune is finally back. This deck was kind of like a fringe, like off-meta deck in set 1. It was a fan favorite deck for sure, focused around taking additional turns with Dimension Shift and using that to just attack the opponent with a bunch of big bodies. Previously, it played Flame Destroyer, which was a 9-drop 7/7 that got -3 cost every 5 spells in your cemetery. So you would try to play them for 0 at spell chain 15, then play D-Shift, untap with them, and then just hit your opponent for like 21. Now we have a better replacement for Flame Destroyer in Kuon, founder of Onmyodo, the new legendary from set 6. He is a 15 cost. He gets -1 cost to play for every spell and Onmyoji card in your cemetery. So instead of just counting spells, he's also counting the followers in his own package, which means he is going to reduce cost quicker. And since he reduces cost for every spell, Flame Destroyer requires you to get to 15. If this guy's at like 12 or 13, you can just play him for 2 or 3 instead of having to play him for a bit more like the Flame Destroyer might have to. He doesn't have Storm on his own, but he does make a 4/5 token and can give Storm to Shikigami followers, so he does do damage the turn he comes down. You can D-Shift, untap, attack with him and the token again. Pretty similar to the Flame Destroyer like kill turns. You're just doing them with Kuon. Big difference is just the Onmyoji package gives you a lot more consistency in getting there than the deck had before. A lot of the Onmyoji cards make the paper Shikigami tokens, and then either buff them or sack them for effects. The paper Shikigamis are 2/2s with last words, draw 1, discard 1. This lets you fill your cemetery very quickly, because you're getting to play the cards that make them, which go to cemetery, and the Shikigamis let you discard a card on death. So you're kind of filling your cemetery twice as fast as the old deck. And it lets you take advantage of cards like Trail of Light, which draw you more cards when they're discarded. So a lot of synergy there. The Onmyoji followers themselves, we actually already mentioned in the Destruction deck. They have just lots of good removal effects, lots of good board building effects. They pretty much are exactly what this deck wanted, to just keep the opponent from being able to kill you while you set up your cemetery. They do it all at once, so very synergistic with this deck. And of course, you have a very powerful suite of removal spells alongside that you're going to be able to use, like Merlin to tutor out and reuse whenever you need, to answer whatever specific threats that your opponent presents. So very powerful deck. It pretty much, its only weakness is either decks that can heal so much that the D-Shift turn can't kill them, which is basically nothing. It's just really Ramp Dragon if they get off a lot of like Sibyls and Dragon Nests, or Destruction Rune if they get Destruction and White up and are able to start healing a lot to get out of range. Those are kind of like your two bad matchups on that front. The other weakness is if the aggro decks are able to just get under you before you're set up. You play enough removal that usually shouldn't happen, but if you draw all of your slower removal, it might be difficult to answer like multiple followers on board at once. And at that point, they do have the potential to just like swarm you too fast. But You have ways to deal with both of those. It kind of just comes down to whether you draw them. The other deck I have in tier 1 is Control Abyss. So this might be a little less popular of a take as well, but I think this deck is insanely powerful this format. I think out of all the control decks this format, it is the one that can best deal with both the D-Shift deck and the aggro decks. We've looked at most of these cards already. It's really just the fact that we're combining them with the old control shell instead of with some of the newer stuff. Yuzuki, of course, 3 cost 5 damage removal, or on play we can make our opponent bury 2 followers. That's great against early game decks or late game decks and like sort of mid game decks. Gensetsu, making the 5 ward tokens, protects us super heavy, and allows us to sort of threaten the opponent with a bunch of, 1/3s that we played for 0 that deal 2 damage if they let them live. Whenever they all die, Gensetsu gets bigger. Her 9 defense makes her incredibly hard to answer. So, we play her, Evo, push up the tokens. Our opponent spends a turn answering the tokens. Now we have like a 5/9 that hits our opponent for 6. And it just gives us very powerful threats. Combining this with the Silence package from set 5 allows this control deck to be unique in that it can attack the opponent both on the front of controlling the board, but also controlling their hand. And that's what makes it good against the D-Shift decks, is that most of the control decks aren't doing very much if the opponent is just sort of building up their hand for one big explosive turn. This deck can attack our opponent's hand by forcing them to discard cards at random, which can really hurt our opponent's setup even if they're not playing to board and trying to go for like one big explosive turn. We can kind of just prevent them from getting there. And sometimes you just play Thundering Roar on turn 2 and you hit the best card in their hand and they have to just like draw pass and you kind of win the game from there. And in addition to all this, of course, we have the Death's Breath being able to recur back our big threats. So this can just let us play Israfil multiple turns in a row. It can let us play Gensetsu multiple turns in a row, which, if any foxes live, allows us to get sort of doubled up value on that. Or if the first Gensetsu lives and we're able to play a second one, then you just start going crazy with all of them. So it has a lot of cards that can just really take over the board that are really hard to answer, while also being able to control decks on more fronts than most of the others can. And of course, the issue of control decks is like survive the aggro decks early onslaught while you get to your good control cards. We're able to play Bellringer Angel and Demonium alongside cards like Surefire Bullet. Thundering Roar itself is a 3 damage removal spell. Wings of Lust or Angelic Snipe. We're able to play all of that in this deck, which gives us probably more answers to early aggro than any of the other control decks have either. So I think this control deck is just the one that has all the answers for everything, making it the best option if you want to play control. And then, of course, D-Shift is just the most resilient combo kill deck. Looking at the tiers, everything I have laid out here, sort of an overcap of all of them. There are a lot of viable decks this format. As I said, anything tier 3 and up I think is a very reasonable pick for a regional or the Grand Showdown, just depending on how much work you want to put into the deck or how much it jives with your playstyle. The honorable mentions, maybe keep them to locals unless you're just really dedicated to them, but they're still decks that have coherent strategies. Obviously, I'm sure I missed someone's favorite deck out there. Don't be offended if your deck is not on this list. Maybe it means I just haven't tested with it much or don't realize that it's a deck. But I will say some of the more obvious stuff that I don't have on here, I think is probably just not worth playing this format. And that might not be because they're a bad deck. That might just be because they're not well positioned into the rest of the decks that are good right now. So yeah. If you have any thoughts on this, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to know what other people think of the format. I'd love to see how this actually ends up playing out at the Grand Showdown and some of the regionals. See if these decks that I think were good are the ones doing all the work, or if maybe some of my lower tier ones here surprise us and overperform. So thank you all for watching. As usual, this was a much longer video than normal. My throat's definitely feeling it, but thank you for sticking out to the end. I'll have some deck profiles coming up in the next couple weeks for a lot of the decks on this tier list, sort of break them down in a bit more detail if you're interested in any of them. So let me know which ones you'd like to see first for sure. And until then, you can watch some of my videos on deck profiles for the last couple sets. You'll see a few on the screen right now. And I will see you all next time.